Orange County Chopper stepped into the spotlight and turned a custom motorcycle into a national obsession. Before the lawsuits, before the split, before the empire expanded and cracked, there was one era when a single chopper defined American television and motorcycle culture at the same time. It was louder than anything on the road. It sold for six figures. It pulled millions of viewers every week, and it happened almost overnight. In 1999, Paul Tootle Sr. opened Orange County Choppers in Montgomery, New York. The shop grew out of his steel fabrication business, Orange County Iron Works. At the same time, the American V-twin market was surging. By the early 2000s, the aftermarket industry was worth more than $5 billion. Harley-Davidson demand stretched months long. Custom parts manufacturers expanded rapidly. Builders across the country pushed bigger engines and wider rear tires into mainstream demand. This was the rise of the power chopper. Frames stretched longer. Rake angles grew steeper. Rear tires reached 240 millimeters, 280 millimeters, even 300 millimeter widths. Paint became layered and elaborate. Chrome covered everything from primary covers to air intakes. These machines were engineered for presence. Television amplified that presence. When American Chopper premiered in 2002, viewership climbed into the millions. Corporate sponsors lined up. Custom builds reached prices between $100,000 and $300,000. OCC moved from a regional shop to a national brand within a few seasons. The Chopper was no longer underground. It was primetime America. The Discovery Channel came knocking in 2002. Reality television was expanding rapidly, and networks were searching for strong personalities and visually engaging crafts. OCC offered both. The initial concept pitched to Paul Sr. was different from what the show eventually became, but after negotiations, American Chopper launched with a formula that would reshape motorcycle culture almost overnight. The first season hit like a spark in dry fuel. American Chopper quickly became one of Discovery's fastest growing programs. At its peak, episodes regularly pulled in between 3.4 and 3.6 million viewers. For a cable network in the early 2000s, those numbers were enormous. The show's appeal extended far beyond riders. Many viewers did not even own motorcycles. They watched for the builds, yes, but also for the personalities. The shouting matches, the deadlines, the father-son tension. The bikes were art pieces under pressure, and the pressure created spectacle. Each episode followed a similar structure: a themed build, a looming deadline, fabrication challenges, explosive arguments, then the dramatic reveal. It was formulaic, but it worked. Corporate sponsors began lining up. Tool companies, car brands, military organizations, each wanted their identity transformed into rolling sculpture. OCC bikes began selling for figures that stunned traditional riders, often ranging from $100,000 to $300,000 depending on the build and sponsorship involvement. The shop itself transformed as quickly as the bikes did. By the mid-2000s, Orange County Choppers was no longer a niche custom builder, it was a brand. OCC merchandise flooded stores: t-shirts, die-cast models, DVDs, branded toolkits. Revenue reportedly exceeded $15 million annually at its peak. The company expanded facilities, invested in retail space, and leaned heavily into licensing. The motorcycle builds were still central, but the business had grown far beyond fabrication. Because this was no longer just a shop, it was a cultural machine. The power chopper aesthetic defined this period. Rear tires ballooned to 240 millimeters, 280 millimeters, even 300 millimeter widths. Frames stretched longer. Rake angles pushed visual drama over practicality. Chrome became dominant. Air intakes were sculpted. Exhaust pipes were theatrical. Many of these machines were far less rideable than the stripped down choppers of decades past. Comfort and handling took a back seat to presence, but presence was the point. OCC understood television better than most custom builders. The bikes needed to look spectacular under studio lighting and camera angles. Every build had to escalate from the last. More aggressive, more detailed, more branded. The Fire Bike, built as a tribute to 9/11 firefighters, became one of the most iconic motorcycles of the era. It toured nationally and positioned OCC not just as entertainers, but as symbolic American builders. And symbolism elevated them beyond mechanics. For a brief window between 2002 and 2008, Orange County Choppers represented the apex of American custom motorcycle culture. They were visible everywhere, on magazine covers, on late-night talk shows, in corporate promotional events. Custom choppers became aspirational status symbols. Owning one signaled excess and confidence during a period of economic expansion in America. But expansion can conceal instability. The very forces that propelled OCC upward were beginning to create cracks beneath the chrome. Rapid growth brought corporate expectations. Television schedules compressed build timelines. Sponsorship obligations multiplied. The bikes became more about theme integration than organic design evolution. What began as passion-driven fabrication was increasingly shaped by media demands. And when media drives craft, tension follows. By the time American Chopper reached its cultural peak, the formula that built the empire was already straining it. The personalities that made the show compelling were also deeply incompatible. The power chopper style, once fresh and dominant, was becoming saturated. Copycat builders flooded the market. The aesthetic that once felt bold began to feel excessive. The rise had been spectacular. But the conditions that made America's greatest chopper possible were also quietly setting the stage for its decline. By 2004, Orange County Choppers was no longer reacting to the custom scene, it was defining it. The power chopper era had reached full volume. Rear tires stretched to 280mm and 300mm widths, far beyond what traditional choppers ever used. Frames were extended and raked aggressively, sometimes exceeding 40 degrees, sacrificing maneuverability for visual dominance. These bikes were long, low, and dramatic. They were designed to be seen from across a parking lot, not carved through corners. The numbers reflected the spectacle. High-end custom builds from major shops often commanded prices between $100,000 and $150,000. Some corporate-sponsored OCC builds reportedly crossed $250,000 once promotional costs and exclusivity were factored in. At the same time, the broader American V-twin aftermarket industry was estimated to be generating over $5 billion annually. Custom part suppliers, wheel manufacturers, paint specialists, and engine builders all rode the same wave. But waves crest before they fall. The Firebike remains one of the clearest examples of how OCC transcended fabrication and entered symbolism. Built as a tribute to firefighters lost in the September 11th attacks, the bike featured engraved names, firehouse imagery, and a deeply patriotic aesthetic. It toured nationally, appearing at memorial events and public exhibitions. It was no longer just a machine, it was a traveling monument. That build elevated OCC beyond entertainment and into emotional branding. That emotional branding became a business strategy. Corporate clients recognized the marketing power of a themed chopper revealed on national television. Snap-on, Tools, Lincoln, military branches. Each collaboration turned motorcycles into promotional sculptures. The bikes were less about rider ergonomics and more about brand storytelling. OCC was not selling transportation. It was selling spectacle, and spectacle commanded attention in an economy that, at the time, rewarded boldness. Because mid-2000s America rewarded boldness everywhere. Between 2002 and 2007, consumer spending in the United States expanded steadily. Credit was accessible, real estate values surged, luxury discretionary purchases flourished. Custom choppers became symbols of prosperity. They were excess-made mechanical. Chrome reflected more than sunlight. It reflected a cultural mood that celebrated size, power, and visual dominance. Then the facility expansion happened. As OCC's fame grew, so did its physical footprint. The company invested heavily in a large retail and production complex in New York. The space included showrooms, merchandise areas, and expanded fabrication capacity. Overhead increased dramatically, staff numbers grew, production expectations rose. The shop that once operated as a specialized custom builder was now supporting television production schedules, retail operations, licensing agreements, and national appearances. Scaling craft is difficult. Television deadlines compressed, build timelines to fit episodic structures. What once may have taken months now had to align with filming schedules. That compression introduced stress. Fabricators had to deliver intricate designs under constant camera presence. The show's drama increasingly centered around missed deadlines and internal conflict. The tension made good television. It did not always make good management, because personality became product. The father-son dynamic between Paul Tutul Sr. and Paul Tutul Jr. shifted from background tension to central storyline. Viewers tuned in for arguments as much as for fabrication. Ratings remained strong, but the balance tilted. When reality television places interpersonal conflict at the forefront, craft becomes secondary. That shift subtly altered how OCC was perceived. They were no longer simply master builders, they were characters in an ongoing drama, and drama has diminishing returns. Meanwhile, the custom motorcycle market was becoming saturated. The power chopper aesthetic, once rare and dramatic, was now everywhere. Smaller shops across the country replicated the stretched frames, oversized tires, and elaborate paint jobs. The exclusivity eroded. When every builder offers a 300mm rear tire and heavy chrome, differentiation becomes difficult. The financial model began to strain. Custom motorcycles at six-figure price points depend on affluent buyers willing to treat machines as art investments. That buyer pool is narrow even in strong economic climates. When credit markets tightened in 2007 and 2008, discretionary spending contracted rapidly. The financial crisis reduced luxury purchases nationwide. Custom motorcycle sales reportedly declined by nearly 50% in the years following the crash. Independent V-twin shops closed in large numbers. The timing was unforgiving. OCC's business model relied heavily on visibility and high-ticket builds. As the recession took hold, corporate sponsorship budgets tightened. Consumers reconsidered large luxury purchases. Banks became less willing to finance speculative custom projects. The very economic environment that had fueled the rise of the power chopper was reversing, and culture was shifting too. Younger riders entering the motorcycle market were gravitating toward performance-oriented machines. European naked bikes, Japanese sport bikes, and later retro-modern standards began gaining popularity. These motorcycles emphasized handling, technology, and usability. The exaggerated geometry and heavy weight of power choppers contrasted sharply with this emerging preference. Excess began to feel dated. The internal conflicts at OCC intensified during this period. In 2009, Paul Jr. was publicly fired from the company by his father during a filmed confrontation. Legal disputes followed over ownership stakes. Key staff members, including fabricators like Vinny DiMartino, departed. The shop lost both creative leadership and technical stability. Viewer fatigue also began setting in. What once felt authentic now felt repetitive. The empire had reached its structural limits. American Chopper concluded its original run in 2010. While later revivals attempted to capture earlier energy, the cultural moment had passed. The power chopper era was closely tied to a specific economic and media landscape. When that landscape changed, the foundation supporting the spectacle weakened. The greatest American chopper was not undone by lack of talent. It was undone by convergence. Economic contraction reduced buyers. Cultural shifts favored performance over ornamentation. Media saturation diluted uniqueness. Internal leadership conflict fractured stability. Each factor alone might have been manageable. Together they proved decisive, and the chrome could not reflect prosperity forever. If the rise of America's greatest chopper was powered by spectacle and prosperity, its fall was shaped by fracture. By the time internal tensions at Orange County Choppers became unavoidable, the brand had already drifted from its original center. The shop that once revolved around steel, welding, and fabrication increasingly revolved around hierarchy and ego. The conflict between Paul Tutul Sr. and Paul Tutul Jr. had always existed, but as television magnified every disagreement, the personal became public property. What once felt like father-son friction evolved into an operational liability. The 2009 firing of Paul Jr. marked the breaking point. The moment was televised, raw, and impossible to reverse. Jr. held a reported 20% ownership stake in the company, and the dispute that followed became both legal and symbolic. Lawsuits over valuation and control added strain to a business already navigating economic turbulence. Key fabricators left alongside Jr. Stability inside the shop diminished. Creative direction fractured. OCC lost not only a designer, but also a significant portion of its public identity. When leadership splits on camera, the brand splits with it. Reality television had amplified OCC's fame, but it also accelerated its vulnerabilities. As the show's seasons progressed, the formula leaned more heavily into confrontation. Episodes centered around shouting matches, late arrivals, and disciplinary arguments. The motorcycles were still present, but they increasingly served as backdrops for personality conflict. Viewer fatigue began setting in. Audiences who initially tuned in for fabrication spectacle now recognized repetition. Drama without evolution becomes predictable. At the same time, the broader industry landscape was changing rapidly. The 2008 financial crisis did more than reduce luxury spending. It altered consumer psychology. Buyers who once pursued bold, extravagant custom builds began prioritizing practicality. Harley-Davidson itself faced declining sales, reporting revenue drops and restructuring efforts in the years following the crash. The custom V-twin aftermarket contracted sharply. Shops across America shuttered. Excess was no longer aspirational. Economic correction exposed structural fragility. The power chopper aesthetic that had once defined American custom culture now felt tethered to pre-recession extravagance. Oversized rear tires and exaggerated exaggerated rake angles symbolized a period of optimism and aggressive consumerism. As economic caution replaced expansion, those same visual cues began to look impractical. Riders gravitated toward motorcycles that balanced performance and usability. European naked bikes and sport touring machines gained favor among younger demographics. Performance began replacing ornamentation. Social media further accelerated the shift. Platforms like Instagram rewarded minimalism, authenticity, and engineering detail over theatrical chrome displays. Custom culture did not disappear, but it diversified. Builders who emphasized craftsmanship, subtle design, and rideability gained traction. The theatrical theme builds that once dominated television struggled to adapt to the new digital ecosystem where constant novelty and visual refinement mattered more than episodic drama. The spotlight had moved elsewhere. Within OCC, attempts to recapture earlier momentum through revivals and rebranding faced a changed environment. The magic of the early 2000s depended on novelty. American Chopper had been among the first shows to blend fabrication and family conflict into mainstream entertainment. By the time revivals aired, audiences had seen countless similar formats. The once revolutionary structure now felt familiar. Timing, not talent, defines many legacies. It is important to separate the cultural moment from the mechanical achievement. OCC and the broader power chopper era did not lack craftsmanship. Fabricators like Vinnie DiMartino and designers like Paul Jr. demonstrated high levels of skill. The Firebike and several tribute builds carried emotional resonance that transcended aesthetics. The shop professionalized televised fabrication. It turned motorcycle building into mainstream storytelling. But cultural dominance rarely lasts without adaptation. The very elements that made America's greatest chopper iconic also limited its longevity. The builds prioritized form over function. They leaned into scale, branding, and visual aggression. When economic contraction and shifting tastes demanded restraint and performance, adaptation proved difficult. The identity was too closely tied to spectacle. Recalibration would have required redefining what OCC represented. Legacy then becomes contextual. Between 2002 and 2008, Orange County choppers symbolized a confident, expansion-era America. The bikes were large, loud, and unapologetically theatrical. They mirrored housing booms, easy credit, and the early days of reality television's explosive growth. They were artifacts of optimism. When that optimism receded, so did the appetite for such overt displays. Greatness is often bound to its era. Today, early OCC builds are preserved as cultural artifacts. They represent a chapter in American motorcycle history when custom fabrication entered living rooms nationwide. Museums display tribute bikes. Enthusiasts revisit episodes as snapshots of a distinct time. The machines themselves remain visually striking, but their significance lies as much in what they represented as how they were constructed. And what they represented was momentum. Momentum driven by television innovation. Momentum driven by economic expansion. Momentum driven by personalities who were larger than the motorcycles they built. When those forces aligned, the result felt unstoppable. When they diverged, the decline felt inevitable. The greatest American chopper did not vanish overnight. It gradually lost alignment with the forces that sustained it. Economic contraction reduced buyers. Cultural shifts favored refinement over spectacle. Internal leadership fractures weakened cohesion. Media saturation diluted uniqueness. Each factor intersected with the others, creating cumulative pressure. Pressure that chrome alone could not withstand. In retrospect, the rise and fall form a complete arc. The birth in a modest New York workshop, the explosion onto cable television, the transformation into a merchandising and licensing empire, the peak defined by national recognition and corporate collaborations, the fracture broadcast to millions, the industry crash, the cultural pivot, all of it compressed into less than a decade. That compression is what makes the story compelling. It was not a slow fade across generations, it was a rapid ascent followed by an equally rapid recalibration. America's greatest chopper became a symbol not only of excess, but of impermanence. Because every cultural phenomenon tied too tightly to its moment faces the same question. What happens when the moment passes? For Orange County choppers and the power chopper era, the answer was not irrelevance. It was transformation. The brand persists in modified form. The builders continue in various capacities. Custom culture continues evolving, but the dominance once experienced between 2002 and 2008 remains unique. Unique because it required specific ingredients: a booming economy, a young reality television industry hungry for personality-driven content, a resurgent Harley-Davidson market, a public appetite for spectacle, a father and son whose conflict translated into ratings. Remove any one of those variables, and the outcome shifts. The story then becomes less about failure and more about timing. America's greatest chopper did not collapse solely because of ego or recession or changing taste. It receded because the conditions that created it were temporary. Its rise was meteoric because the environment amplified it. Its fall was swift because that environment shifted just as quickly, and that is what makes it great. Not because it endured unchanged, but because for a brief, concentrated span, it defined American motorcycle culture more visibly than any custom movement before it. It turned welding sparks into primetime television. It made fabricators into household names. It turned chrome into a symbol of national confidence. Then the era ended, but the imprint remains.